Hello and welcome to The Absolute Truth with Emerald Robinson. I'm Eduardo Norret, in for Emerald all week. The Supreme Court issued a major ruling yesterday in favor of Donald Trump. The court ruled unanimously that Colorado could not keep Trump off the ballot, so it's a win for democracy, as we told you yesterday. It means that Americans can vote for the candidates of their choice without interference from partisan elites in blue states. Ironically, the left, the very same left that has been claiming for the entirety of Biden's presidency that they're the ones trying to defend democracy, Trump is trying to destroy democracy, they were outraged at yesterday's ruling. Here's just a few of the examples from the Democratic Party's allies in the media.
We've learned that it was a 9-0 decision ruling that Donald Trump can be on the ballot in Colorado and other states.
I'm not confident that that will produce a result that's good for American democracy.
This is actually what I had been concerned about. I had been concerned that should it go to the Supreme Court, they would rule this way.
I'd laugh if it weren't so sad.
My next guest says Donald Trump is still an oath-breaking insurrectionist. Do you have confidence in the Supreme Court? Do you think this court is partisan?
The court itself may have overstepped.
The court went way further than it needed to go.
Our colleague Melissa Murray has called this Supreme Court the YOLO court.
The criticism of the court is that they're playing interference.
Not since Bush v. Gore have we seen a court that's had this many opportunities to interfere in the election.
The headline here is that this is a unanimous ruling, but if you scratch the surface just a little.
This is a 5-4 ruling on part of it.
This is actually a 5-4 decision.
It's 5-4.
Trump will take this, spin it, spread the misinformation, disinformation on it. So it's a win for them.
He's on the ballot and voters will vote, and he looks like he's headed to become the Republican nominee for president.
You can't save a people from themselves. If they're determined to reelect him after he organized that insurrection, then there's nothing to stop the people from doing that.
Meanwhile, Democratic members of Congress like Jamie Raskin are saying they're working to pass a congressional law to keep Trump off the ballot. They just can't accept the Supreme Court's ruling.
I am working with a number of my colleagues, including Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Eric Swalwell, to revive legislation that we had to set up a process by which we could determine that someone who committed insurrection is disqualified by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And the House of Representatives already impeached Donald Trump for participating in insurrection by inciting it. So the House has already pronounced upon that.
So apparently they really thought the Supreme Court would rule to keep Trump off the ballot. They're really that delusional. So joining me now to react to all of this is the legendary Roger Stone. He is a seasoned political operative, speaker, pundit, New York Times bestselling author. He's a veteran of 13 national presidential campaigns, including those of Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and of course, Donald Trump. And he hosts the Stone Zone on Rumble and the Roger Stone Show on WABC Radio in New York City on Sundays from 4 to 6. Roger, thanks for joining us.
Eduardo, delighted to be here.
Roger, let me ask you, if you were advising President Trump on this matter, and perhaps you already are, with this victory on the Colorado case, but many cases still looming ahead of the election, how would you advise him to navigate this politically, as he's going to have to likely split, court time from the campaign trail, and he's going to have to address, these indictments and these court cases to a certain segment of the electorate?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to understand what the Supreme Court did yesterday. They had a very, very narrow ruling. Yes, it was a tremendous victory for the president. They essentially ruled that the states do not have the authority to block a federal candidate from the ballot. They didn't really address the larger question of whether the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, specifically Article 3, would make Donald Trump ineligible to be president. Once again, the argument is that he's never been charged or convicted of insurrection. So if you say that he engaged in insurrection, that's your opinion. We don't make laws on the basis of opinions of certain elected Democrats. You have also seen in the last 24 hours open speculation that, okay, if he can be on the ballot, and in the event that he wins, we will simply refuse to certify his selection by the Electoral College. Wait a minute. Isn't that exactly what they're accusing Donald Trump of doing? And in the same breath claiming that that would be a crime. Meanwhile, Jamie Raskin, who's replaced Adam Schiff as the single most odious Democrat in Congress, is actively admitting that he's trying to find a legislative workaround for the Supreme Court. So an important victory, but I do think it has to be seen within the context of the upcoming decision pertaining to immunity by former presidents, and also the coming criminal trials against Donald Trump, prospectively in Florida, Washington, D.C., and of course in Fulton County, Georgia.
Let me ask you, there's been a lot of analysis and talk about the team Trump has had around him, both from 2016 to 2020 and now 2024, a team that has really helped him resurrect his own political career. But of course, there's the argument that no one could have done that but Trump himself. It doesn't really matter who he has around him. But when you look at the team going into 2024 and the team that he will likely take into the White House with him if he wins, how does that compare to the group from 2020? I mean, in his first term, there were a lot of rhinos with him. There was a lot of criticisms for people like Jared Kushner, the globalist wing, the Gary Cohns of the world who were able to weasel their way in the White House. So as you assess the team around him that he has right now, what grade would you give? Are you more confident about those that President Trump has chosen to surround himself with?
Well, first of all, I think Donald Trump is a very different man than he was when he first was elected to the presidency in 2016. I now think he has a more deeper, broader understanding of the swamp, of the uniparty, and of the fact that many Republicans, while they swear fealty in public and in private, cannot really be trusted. In terms of the president's current campaign team, I think they're running the single best presidential campaign I've seen in my lifetime, and I'm a veteran of 45 years in this particular arena. And that is demonstrated by his historic victories in Iowa. He didn't just win the Iowa caucuses, he tripled the previous margin by my old boss, Senator Bob Dole, who won the 88 caucuses by about 12.5%. Despite the fact that Nikki Haley attempted to flood the Republican primary in New Hampshire with non-Republicans, despite the fact that Trump was outspent almost 2-1, he still beat her by solid double digits. And then, of course, he destroyed Nikki Haley in her own home state of South Carolina, where once again she tried to get Democrats to cross into our process and vote in the Republican primary. Democrats who will be voting for the Democratic presidential nomination. So on the political side, I have a high degree of confidence regarding those around the president. I also think the president is much more cognizant now of the uniparty, of the deep state, call them whatever you want. He certainly understands that the criminal justice system has been completely and totally weaponized. Sometimes his lawyers frustrate me. So, for example, in the Colorado decision, they argued for a narrow decision, and they got a narrow decision. They never argued to have the court declare whether Trump could be barred from office, from being sworn in under the Fourth Amendment. Just use that as an example. Also in this upcoming immunity case, where the president has argued to the lower court in D.C. that he's entitled to presidential immunity. The trial judge ruled against him. He then appealed that to the D.C. Circuit, extremely liberal activist circuit. No surprise that they also ruled against him. But in that proceeding, when the president's lawyer was asked by one of the justices, well, if Donald Trump ordered SEAL Team 6 to murder his political opponent and then murder any senator or congressman who wanted to impeach him over that, would he have immunity for that? I believe the president's lawyer gave a qualified yes as an answer. That's not the correct answer. The president would only have immunity for those responsibilities and actions that fall within the purview of his duties as president. And that hypothetical, which is meant to be, hyped, would not meet that criteria. The left went to town with that. I think it was just an honest error by the president's lawyer. But I was a little disappointed in that. Overall, Trump was a great president in his first term. I think he's going to be an even greater president in his second term.
I got to be honest, I think some of the concerns going into 2024 are these election integrity issues in many states. Some states have done enough to shore up what was done in 2020 when the Democrat legislatures and governors changed the law to allow basically unlimited, no reason necessary vote by mail. There are a lot of states that haven't changed that. We're going here with a new election season with the RNC. They're looking for new leadership. Going into the election, what are your thoughts about election integrity and what Republicans have done? Have they done enough in some of these swing states? And if not, how does Trump overcome that? Does he overcome that on the raw vote totals alone? Is it about increasing the margin, making it basically too difficult for them to cheat? What are your thoughts on that issue?
Excellent question. This is the single greatest concern that I have. I really believe the president is inexorably moving towards a successful election. So the only question now is, will the election be a free, fair, honest, transparent election? Frankly, the Republican National Committee, which he does not control, raised a huge amount of money for the purposes of election integrity, but I didn't see, outside of a few states, any effort to go into the swing states particularly and reform the state election laws back to the way they were pre-COVID-19, because the changes in election law are really what opened the door to the massive fraud, the anomalies and irregularities in our last election. So yes, for example, Wisconsin, they have improved the law. In Pennsylvania, for example, where mail-in ballots are absolutely, positively, unquestionably unconstitutional. Very specifically, the lower and middle courts knocked them out, but the state Supreme Court, which is extremely liberal and Democrat and activist, ruled them back in. Can any Republican ever really carry Pennsylvania as long as the Philadelphia machine, which is, let's face it, they have really refined voter theft and fraud to an art form there. Can we have an honest election? President Trump and his team are well aware of this issue. They have a working group. There are legal and technological steps that must be taken to try to ensure a fair election. Number one, first and foremost, is just being prepared.
Right.
So, for example, in Detroit, if the election officials want to close down the count and want to throw out the Republican observers, one has to be able to go directly to a judge immediately and get an order to stop that. Just giving that as an example. So yes, it is a major concern. No, we do not yet have a perfect answer, but yes, we are cognizant about it. When I say we, I mean supporters of the president, and it is being worked on.
Let me ask you, one of the reasons that President Trump is looking, his outlook is looking very positive ahead of a few months out of the election, is because of his growing support among minority voters. So that New York Times poll that came out over the weekend, Trump is winning with Hispanics by about 6 points. He's increased his support among black voters by 500%, now polling at around 22, 23%. So my question for you is twofold. Number one, do you believe those polls? In other words, I certainly believe that he's increased with minority voters, but I think just based off the history, I'd be shocked if any Republican got, more than 20%. They would win in a landslide. So number one, do you believe that? Do you think it's being overstated maybe? And then number two, if true, what do you think the reason is? Yesterday, I had someone on the show, Vince Everett Ellison, who was speaking from the position of the black community, and he sees Trump's increasing support among black voters more of a Biden thing. He thinks Biden has so failed the black community that they are turning to Trump because they have no other choice. I pressed him, and I see it a little differently. I think it's a little bit of both, but certainly Trump has appealed to them in a way that other Republicans have not in the past. So are those polls real? Do you believe them? And if so, what is the reason for his increased support amongst those voters?
First of all, I think those polls are real because you don't just look at any one poll. You look at a number of polls with solid methodology that are taken within the same time frame and have a large enough sample to be scientifically valid. And they all show pretty much the same thing, which is that he's making very significant gains among African-American voters and among Hispanic voters. In both cases, I think this is economically driven. I think those voter groups are beginning to realize that they had it much better in terms of gasoline prices, in terms of the wage increases, in terms of the availability of jobs, and in terms of the buying power of their dollars under Donald Trump. So I think to the great extent, those things are being driven by economic factors. We had, for example, the lowest rate of unemployment among Black voters in American history under Donald Trump. Is there some feeling in that community where many believe that they have been the unfair recipient of a broken criminal justice system, and that Donald Trump has now been subjected to the same bias that many people in that community feel? Yes, to a certain extent, that is true. The 1994 crime bill, for example, written by Joe Biden, signed into law by Bill Clinton, the law that insists on the harsh mandatory penalties for the first-time nonviolent crime of possession of small amounts of drugs for personal use, that has been used to disproportionately incarcerate hundreds of thousands of poor people and Black people, is a perfect example of the institutional racism of some of our laws. Who was it who got us for the first time ever criminal justice reform? Why, that would be Donald J. Trump. So I think that's a little bit of a factor. It is clear to me that particularly among Hispanics, this is historic. The Republican candidate has never led the Democratic candidate among Hispanic voters in the United States in the history of the country. We have inexorably moving up in terms of our share of the vote, but actually taking the lead among Hispanics, that's a watershed moment.
Just as President Trump is increasing with these demographic groups, there are also polls that show, I think one that came out yesterday, showing that 1 in 7 Republican voters will refuse to vote for him. That's sort of what they say. Regardless of whether or not that's true, President Trump has to win over some independent-minded voters, some suburban voters, and I think on the economics issue alone, he can do that. But if you were with him in the room, if you're advising President Trump right now, what is your message to him on how to win those voters back? Or maybe is it another strategy entirely? Is it, we're doing well enough with these minority voters and our base that if we lose a little bit of the suburban, we'll make up the difference? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? And if you were advising him, what would you say?
See, look, I think that the factor that is going to bring you more Black votes, more Hispanic votes, is Donald J. Trump. It's Trump himself. It's Trump in his fundamental message of peace and prosperity. People realize we're on the edge of a nuclear war. They realize that we are shipping $280 billion abroad to protect the borders of a foreign country when we will not spend the money, nor do we have the resolve to protect our own borders. Where we must make gains, frankly, is among women voters. We've made no significant gains among women voters since 2016. So yes, I would urge the president, if he asked my advice, to select a woman as his running mate, but it has to be a woman that meets a certain criteria. This person has to have the experience, the judgment, the temperament to actually be president, to actually do the job if, God forbid, something should happen to Trump. It has to be someone who, on the big picture issues of war and peace, the right to life, Second Amendment rights, and sealing our border, is solid on those issues. And then it has to be someone who, by virtue of the fact that they are a woman, helps you reach out to some constituencies you don't already have, millennials, women, and so on. Now, does that perfect candidate exist? Well, that remains to be seen. But normally, and President Nixon once told me, look, when searching for a running mate, don't try to find somebody who helps you, just find someone who doesn't hurt you. Normally I think that's sound advice, but in this case, with Trump leading Biden, but still under 50, we do need to find a pool of new voters in a very tight electorate in which everybody has an opinion of both Joe Biden or of Donald Trump. Politics is a lot like chess, Eduardo. The person who controls the middle of the board wins the game. So I would be looking for the president, hopefully, to do something historic, something outside the box when it comes to the selection of his running mate.
In other words, choose a woman, just make sure it's not Nikki Haley.
Yeah, I would certainly subscribe to that. The idea of ticket balancing, those days are over. If Donald Trump selected Nikki Haley as his running mate, he would need a food taster. And I think we all know that.
Roger, one more quick question before we go to break on the 2024 election. I know you've talked a lot about this, whether Joe Biden will be the nominee come the DNC convention this summer. Michelle Obama, spokesperson, curiously announcing today that she's not running for president, but of course doesn't rule out, being appointed at the convention. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think he will ultimately be on the ticket? And if not Michelle Obama, let's say based on the news today, who are some other options that you think give us the best odds, the best stone odds on becoming the Democratic nominee?
Well, when I woke up this morning and I saw that Michelle Obama had released a statement saying she's not running, I said to myself, well, there it is, the absolute proof that she's running. That's how politics works. Look, Joe Biden can't make it based on his deteriorating physical and mental condition, his horrific record in office, and the epic crime surrounding his family members, including Hunter and Jimmy and the rest of the Biden crime family. And the Democrats know that. They also know that Kamala Harris cannot win a general election against Donald Trump. So I still believe that Biden will roll up enough delegate votes to be nominated. And then shortly before the convention, he will announce that he's decided not to run. He won't accept the nomination. That doesn't mean he's resigning, just means that he's not running again. He'll release his delegates and he'll urge the convention to work its will. It is that point that I'm still convinced that the convention will insist upon, will demand the candidacy of Michelle Obama, and that she will be appealed to on the basis that she is the strongest potential candidate to defeat Donald Trump. So if I gave the impression I thought that she would run for president, that would be technically incorrect. I think that she will be drafted for president. I still believe she's the most likely Democratic nominee. You could not replace Joe Biden with Gavin Newsom when you have a woman of color, who's vice president and next in line. That is a substantial problem for the Democrats, and they will have to deal with that problem in some way.
Well, it's hilarious. It's sort of the race-based system they've created for themselves. Roger Stone, stick around. We'll be back with much more after the break.
Thank you.
And plus, straight ahead, Dr. Walid Phares joins us on the reported ceasefire deal in the Middle East. That's after the break. We're back with the legendary Roger Stone. Roger, I wanted to ask you, you've had an illustrious political career working for Nixon, Reagan, Bush Sr., Trump. Between all of those, and I know how you feel about Bush Sr., but between, let's say, the three of your more favored presidential candidates you work for, how would you rank them? How would you compare them amongst each other? I mean, which one was the smartest purely intellectually? Which one had the best sense of pure retail politics, political skill? Just give us some insight into each of them and what your experience was like.
Very tough question. The smartest of them, quite obviously, intellectually and in every other way, was Richard Nixon. He was also a micromanager, which I think in the end was one of the contributing factors to his downfall. But he really is underrated. He ended the Vietnam War, gave us a strategic arms limitation agreement with the Soviets, opened the door to China at a time that China was a dirt poor, backwards, non-technical agrarian society. No way for Nixon to see that 30 years later, the Bushes and the Clintons would give China most favored nation trading status, which has made them the danger they are today. Nixon also obviously unilaterally saved Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Reagan was very great because he understood the importance of the leader as a symbol. So his background as an actor, I think, allowed him to impart to the American people a certain level of confidence regarding the strength and the courage and the confidence for the country of their president. Donald Trump is great in his own way. He's unlike anybody I've ever worked for in the sense that he's very much his own man. He's not a confection. He's not being driven by polling or focus groups or advisors and so on. What you see is what you get. He has extraordinary political and public relation instincts. And like Reagan, he has a certain set of inviolable principles that he believes in, such as low taxes, a strong military, but suspicion about foreign entanglements where our inherent national interests are not necessarily clear. So all of them great in their own way, but next to Nixon, Trump has faced a withering assault from the political media establishment that is unlike anything I have ever seen. It was bad enough in the days of Nixon, but in the days of Nixon, there was no internet. If we'd had the internet in 1973 and 4, and Nixon had had a platform from which to launch a counterattack and a defense, I think he might have survived. It's very hard to look back at what he was driven from office for today and not realize that these are small potatoes compared to the crimes of the Obamas and the Bidens. So Trump has been subjected to an onslaught unlike anything I've ever seen. And what's amazing about him, Eduardo, is that with all of this, he remains calm. He remains resilient. He remains determined. He remains confident. His mood is good. His health is good. He's lost a little weight. He kind of thrives on the fight. A lesser man might buckle under this kind of pressure. He's facing 91 criminal charges and 600 years in prison. But he's a happy warrior, meaning he is willing to make the fight for the country. It's not about him. It really isn't. If it were about him, he could simply not run again and go have the greatest life in the world. Play golf when he feels like it, enjoy his family, enjoy his palatial residences. But no, he's doing this because he loves the country. He faces this great personal peril to himself simply because he loves the country and he will not let it go down without a fight.
When I look at political consultancy, your industry, the industry you came from, it strikes me as an industry these days where people fail upwards. I mean, nowadays, people can charge millions of dollars to be a consultant. You can lose the election that you're consulting, and yet you'll still continue to get work. So when you assess the current class of political advisors and consultants in compared to your days in the action, how would you compare it? Do you think there are skilled operatives on the right, as skilled as maybe from the time that you were advising Nixon, Reagan, and Bush? And do you have confidence that maybe this next generation of political advisors could help Republicans in years to come? And if someone came to you and said, Roger, I want to do what you did, you know, it's 2024, the game is a little different now, what advice would you give someone like that?
Well, the answer is there are much, much fewer and not nearly as many skilled and talented individuals. A lot of people who are attracted to politics from its populist expansion don't understand that this is a science. There's no guessing involved. That you, generally speaking, to plot out a successful campaign, you do it on the basis of scientifically collected data, polling, sophisticated polling, in which you test ideas and themes and potential vulnerabilities of your opponent, potential strengths of yourself. The very best people in this business today, ironically, are currently working for Donald Trump. By that I mean Chris LaCivita from Virginia, Susie Wiles, James Blair. So these are some of the most talented people in the party. They know what they're doing, and of course, the results show in the early primary returns. For those who would like to do what I have done or be involved in politics as an avocation, I just urge you to recognize that you don't operate on the basis of theories or hunches or rumors or conventional wisdom. That this is a scientific business. You have a limited number of days, a limited number of dollars with which to communicate to voters. 80% of your resources must go into direct communication with voters. And as to what that message is, well, I don't ask you to change your position, but I ask you to test your positions to see what the candidate should emphasize, what the candidate should de-emphasize. Just recognize that this is a highly scientific, data-driven industry, and a presidential campaign or a campaign for any office has to be a scientifically based, data-driven campaign where you test to see where are people getting their news. If voters are listening to talk radio, then you spend your resources on talk radio. If they're getting their news from cable news, then you spend your money in cable news. So you have to make sure that your resource allocation is as efficient as possible, both in terms of the content of the messaging, pre-tested content that we know the voters will react to based on our polling, and an application where you know most of the voters are getting their news and their information.
That's a great advice. Roger, last question. You are regarded as one of the best dressed men in politics. So give me an assessment right here from A to F. Do I make the cut? Do I make the Roger Stone cut? And if not, give me some advice. Give me some tips on what I can do so that next time I'm better dressed.
Well, first of all, you have the classic Donald Trump red power tie and his signature dark navy suit. So yes, it's a great look. You do need a white pocket handkerchief, a white pocket square.
Fair.
Leaving the house without one, Eduardo, is almost like leaving the house naked. But that's the only thing I would add for a great look.
Well, I passed the test. Roger Stone, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Great to be with you. God bless you.
A reported ceasefire has been reached between Hamas and Israel. More on that next.
You know, the president and I have been very clear that Israel has a right to defend itself, that we have got to make sure that innocent civilians aren't being killed, and that we've got to get these hostages out. And that is one of the highest priorities right now we have. And I'll tell you, the president has been an extraordinary leader in getting us to this point that we have the 6-week deal. And so Hamas needs to do its thing, as I talked about yesterday in Selma. We all want this conflict to end as soon as possible, and how it does matters.
So that's Vice President Kamala Harris. You heard her. She just wants Hamas to do its thing. I don't know what that means. What is Hamas's thing actually? Let's take a look.
أبو حسن خالد معك كيف حالك؟ سلامات. وين ايش اخبار؟ وين انت؟ وين السبايا والدنيا ودين عنا خليك نايم. انت بالشارع نام في الدار شارع اسكت احنا عند السبايا هنا مسك وحده. اسكت. وين ايش اخبارك؟ لا حبيبي. وين انت؟ والله روحنا اسكت. ايش كيف الامور؟ والله كويس اسكت والله نار. لقيت شيء؟ ايه؟ لقيت شيء؟ جبنا فرس يا حاج. ايش جبت؟ خيل فرس. جاب حصان؟ صار اصلا اصيل مش حصان كديش تبع القرعان. انت مين جبته؟ مين
So you just heard audio of Hamas terrorists talking amongst each other as they were capturing innocent Israeli civilians. That's who Kamala Harris just wants to let them do their own thing. Terrorists. So after months of vicious fighting, the White House is now saying that a ceasefire deal between Hamas and Israel is on the table. According to U.S. intelligence sources, the Israelis have already agreed to the deal, but Hamas's leadership, meanwhile, is dragging their feet. This comes as the Israeli war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip continues to rage on each day. It's really somewhat remarkable that the Biden administration has even been able to get Israel to agree to these terms, if they are even true. Relations between Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have soured in recent months. They reportedly haven't even spoken to each other in weeks. Part of the reason for this is the Biden administration has been pressuring Netanyahu's government, which depends on the United States for military aid, intelligence assistance, and diplomatic support, to stop the fighting in Gaza entirely. They've been doing this and pushing Israel to do this almost since the war started. And so once you learn what details of the supposed deal even are, it's more shocking to hear that Israel has even agreed. For example, the deal does not require an accurate account of Israeli hostages, nor does it require every single hostage's release. So obviously this is causing consternation among the Israelis, and it actually further threatens Netanyahu's political position. Joining me now to react to all of this is Dr. Walid Phares. He's a national security expert and a foreign policy expert. He's author of the book Iran, An Imperialist Republic and U.S. Policy. Dr. Phares, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for inviting me today.
So first off, what do you make of the supposed ceasefire agreement? I know that the terms are still being reported on, but do you really see it as any sort of long-term solution for Israel in the Middle East, or do you see it as more of a stopgap problem for a couple of weeks and months?
Eduardo, the issue is that I personally witnessed during the Lebanese war before I emigrated for 15 years, many attempt to create a ceasefire between the ancestors of Hamas, the radical organizations, the Ba'ath Saika organization during the fight in Lebanon. Guess how many ceasefires didn't survive? 103. Of course, it was 10 years, but that's enormous. Hamas is trying to use the ceasefires for very simple strategic reasons. They want to stop the Israelis from ending the Hamas organization. That's goal number one, and a ceasefire will do it. They want to continue to use the hostages, the Israeli and other international hostages, until they can either regain the control of Gaza, or if not, if they will have to leave the leadership, they will use them as a exchange money. But the most important is that Hamas is now using the will of supporters around the world who are pressuring all these governments in the West, including this administration. And this administration, instead of aligning with Israel, aligning with Saudi, aligning with Egypt, is actually giving an opportunity for Hamas to survive.
I want to ask you about that, but first, what do you think it is about Hamas in the modern 21st century in 2024? How have they been able to garner so much sympathy and so much support, especially among Western populations?
Well, that's a complex story that my book covers in details. Number one, they are backed by a very important player with whom this administration and the Obama administration have a deal. And that's the Islamic Republic of Iran. Tehran is, in turn, sending the money that we send them in view of that agreement. And Hamas uses all that money to strengthen themselves, to establish a gigantic, first of all, propaganda machine, but of course, military machine and intelligence machine. That's why this little portion of land, which is Gaza, act as if it was a great power fighting the Israelis, because they have all that money. But more important, Eduardo, is the fact that they have an ideology. They have adopted and they go by the ideology of jihadism. As you know, in my books, previous books, I've detailed what it was about, which is the establishment of an Islamic emirate in Gaza that will be part of the Islamic Humanist empire that Tehran wants to establish. So beyond anything they receive, they're going to continue this fight till the end because they're ideological.
I want to go back 4 years and look at the big picture of how we got here. 4 years ago, we had peace in the Middle East. We had a near agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. ISIS was decimated, no Iran deal on the table. And now 4 years later, there's complete chaos in the region. Biden has pushed the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates closer to the Chinese. There's obviously war in Israel, as we just talked about. Iran is emboldened. Their militias are emboldened. The Saudis now remarkably urging the United States to show some restraint against the Houthis. It's like someone has flipped the tables over entirely. So how did we get here? And to me, it's more than just incompetence. You know, even the worst type of incompetence could not do this. This is deliberate. So walk the audience through some of the policy and really the ideology behind why this is happening. The people who are doing this, why are they doing this? Why are they putting the United States in this position? And what do they seek to gain?
Eduardo, you're among the very few who use a term that is absolutely crucial to understand what's happening. It's not incompetence. It's not chaos in the White House. The machinery within this administration that is actually in communication with the Iran regime, with the Muslim Brotherhood networks, is also ideological. And it started this whole campaign of rapprochement and collaboration with both the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic, and the Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt, meaning the core intellectuals of the Obama administration. They started this in 2009. We remember in June of that year, just a couple of months after election, there was a whole wave of intellectuals, academics, individuals, militant activists were brought in to the administration, which explains why in June of 2009, President Obama at the time sent a letter to Grand Ayatollah Khamenei, offering a collaboration, the collaboration that ended up becoming the Iran deal in 2014 and 15. Now, the Iran deal, I argued in my book, is a transaction, meaning we are sending, according to that deal, many billions of dollars. The estimate is $150 billion to the Iran regime. But in those transactions, there are brokers, and the brokers usually, even in international transactions, would obtain gain one way or another, and the gains are about 10%. Let's imagine this number. And 10% of $150 billion, we're talking about $15 billion have been invested back into the United States by the Iranian regime, by the Islamists, and that's a lot of influence. So when people ask me, why aren't we able to push back against the Iranian, expansion in the region? The problem is not in the Middle East. The problem is here in Washington. That huge influence was capable of creating massive changes in our foreign policy. And I hope, of course, I lived during the time of the Trump administration, having served in the Trump campaign, the 2016 campaign. I know a little bit about how influence operates here. The Trump administration was able to, first of all, withdraw from that deal, which is catastrophic for Iran. And second, designate the militia, the central militia of the regime as terrorists. That's why his administration, his supporters were punished by the money of the Iran deal. And that's why the Biden administration, trying to go back to the Obama administration's policy, is not doing anything in Yemen against the Houthis, against Hezbollah, against the militias in Iraq and Syria, and obviously it's trying to pressure Israel to accept the ceasefire. It's all connected, Eduardo.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned your service in advising President Trump, and obviously you've advised other presidential candidates like Mitt Romney, Ben Carson. And so a fear that I think many Americans, or Americans should have rather, is that despite who wins in November, let's say Donald Trump gets elected into office, that the damage done in the Middle East is too deep, is too far gone to even fully reverse it. And so what are your thoughts on that? What must the next Republican president do on day one to try to restore and reverse a lot of what Biden has done? Is it too late? Do you think some of these relations can be restored and some of the damage can be reversed?
Even if it's late, it's never too late, but the difference in price, had the Trump administration, to be very honest and clear, since I served the most critical time, which is when all of these dossiers from the Abraham Accord to the Arab Coalition to Safe Zone in the Middle East, I was the first named advisor and spoke with the candidate then at the end of 2015 about most of these projects. The danger is once the administration arrives, they need to have the right teams with them. Because even if the choice is good, we know a little bit about the agenda. I know a lot about that agenda. If you don't have the right teams to manage, because what is happening is not normal anymore in American politics, as it was the game between Democrats and Republicans, the differences in foreign policies were very small. But now there is no more consensus. There is no more bipartisanship. There is an ideological elite that wants to go back to those national security threats and then bypass them. So what needs to be done now is that the Republican candidate, who most likely will be the winner, according to the polls, if nothing else happens, should surround himself with teams who understand strategically the threat and immediately. You said about time. Maybe the next administration will need 2 years just to, I call it, clean up, reorganizing, assembling the teams.
You mentioned Trump, and I don't think I've ever really heard you talk about this publicly. So if you're comfortable, I'd like to ask you, and not to necessarily reveal anything specific from your conversations with him, but just generally speaking, when you're in the room with Trump and you're explaining to him Mideast policy, and I think to his credit, he doesn't get enough credit for this. He really understands the region. I mean, talk about what his knowledge is of what's going on in the players. I think it would surprise most people to understand how much Trump really knows about what's going on in the Middle East, no?
It will surprise them a lot when they will read the chapters about my service to the Trump campaign in my memoirs. Not immediately, but
soon to be released.
Soon to be hopefully released. One example I could give: the very first meeting. I've met with many Republican candidates over the years and members of Congress. I had many files, with a lot of talk and talking points. He said, "Put this aside. Show me those maps." So why does he want me to show him the maps? So I showed him the maps, and then he said, put that information on the maps. And then we went through all the situation country by country. First of all, as an international businessman, he knew these actors, most of these actors, not as a politician yet, but he had a good idea. This is something the public here doesn't understand really, that he came from an international career. And then when we put that information and we spoke about these projects, he would look at them. Because he was a real estate strategist, he understands the balance of power. He understands who has interest in doing what. So he On his arrival to the White House, when he was briefed by his major advisors, he already understood the matter. The problem is that the bureaucracy has pushed back, and every single choice he made, including the withdrawal from the Iran deal, that was the most important achievement he's done. It allowed him to coalesce with 52 Arab and Muslim countries. It allowed him also to reinforce the relationship with Israel. And also he spoke about Kurds and minorities. He was very ready. Those who were not ready, basically, were the American public, who were not given a chance to understand that because of the role that you know very well of the negative media. The media did not give a chance to the Trump administration to explain the achievements. And that's why people should start writing as historians of what really happened in the past.
I hope they will. Dr. Walid Phares, sorry, we got to run. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Coming up, an update on the January 6 trials being held in Washington, D.C. We talk to an activist who's been helping those defendants. That's next. Well, it was a massive ruling by the Supreme Court yesterday. It sent shockwaves throughout the political landscape. The court delivered a unanimous 9-0 decision, striking down Colorado's effort to disenfranchise millions of voters across the country. They wanted to keep Donald Trump off the ballot. The Supreme Court also ruled that the Constitution makes Congress, and not the states, responsible for enforcing Section 3 of the 14th Amendment against federal office holders. Well, what does that mean? It means that left-wing blue states like Colorado, other states are trying to do this too, like Illinois and Maine, it means they cannot insert their own partisan actors to interfere in an election. Now, a group called Condemn USA and its founder, Trennis Evans, filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court in support of Donald Trump. The group is also working to get January 6 trials out of the hyper-partisan D.C. court system. So will that work? There are a number of January 6 defendants still in prison awaiting trial. So joining us now to give us an update on all of that is Trennis Evans. He's the founder of Condemn USA, and he joins us now.
Thank you so much for having me today, Eduardo. I'm glad to be here. These cases that you're watching, what you saw in the 9-0 verdict in the Supreme Court, our amicus one is 100% correct, and we were the only amicus that was 100% correct. We got it right on all 3 points. We knew about the 41st Congress. You're talking back when Ulysses S. Grant was president. We can thank our researcher and attorney John Mosley for that effort. And then, of course, the error that was made by the court, the lower court in Colorado, to accept this quasi-court proceeding evidence that happened with the select committee, which was nothing more than hearsay. There was no meaningful cross-examination. It's not a court of law. As we know, that's a legislative action function, as what's supposed to happen there when the select committee was really anything but. So the third point there, the Fourth Act of 1870 had controlled some of these issues already, and it was determined that Congress had to legislate something. So, like I said, the original 14th Amendment in the 39th Congress was really expelled and pulled together, and there was a deliberation. Congress came up with a solution under the 41st Congress, and nobody seemed to know about it. As a matter of fact, we went out and begged members of Congress and members of the Senate to join our amicus brief, and they seemed to come in later with their own version, and they didn't quite get it correct.
So in these cases of the January 6 defendants, by my count, I believe there are about a dozen or more who are still in prison awaiting trial. I mean, what is the prognosis of them getting out of the D.C. trial system? I mean, they're not going to get a fair jury. D.C. is 97% liberal. So you've been trying to get these cases moved out of D.C. Are you having any success? What type of arguments are you making? And tell us a little bit about some of these people who are still in prison.
Yeah, so let me start with your first question. So I filed some work originally with the Proud Boys case, and we helped with that case there. And Roger Roots and Steve Metcalf filed some of that work early on. Now, that work has largely been expanded since August of 2022, and now you're seeing the work in its full completion and veracity happening now in the A.J. Fisher case, not to be confused with the Fisher case that's on the 1512, currently to be set to be heard by the Supreme Court. That case is totally different. So we're talking about a change of venue motion that's been filed for A.J. Fisher. This was filed December 18th, I believe, original filing, and then our response just came in here at the end of February. That case is an all-important motion. It is proving that it is absolutely destructive to the idea that Haldeman and Delaney and some of these Nixon-era cases that have been precedent now for 50, 70 years are absolutely fallible and that the dissenting judges' opinions back then were actually correct. You would see now anyone that reads this, it's at a sixth grade reading level, can recognize that when the government implemented this diversity, equity, and inclusion ideology, that they have now applied it in every facet of government. And they now want to silo jurors and suggest that diversity, equity, and inclusion idea of implicit bias, which is the study of the subconscious mind, doesn't apply to jurors and it doesn't have a disparative effect on the juror. And it does. There's no way around it. We now know that this bias or juror bias exists. We can prove it, and we have the data science to back up those studies like never before. Open source data like Google Trends. And you think in these terms, Eduardo, the Rudy Giuliani case with Ruby Freeman, Judge Beryl Howell actually brought that evidence in or allowed that evidence to be admissible to determine damages against Rudy Giuliani for Ruby Freeman. It's awfully funny to me. I think God works in very mysterious ways, and he did his bidding here by allowing them to utilize this exact evidence as Google Trends and show these disparities between the federal district and anywhere else in the country. And then the meltwater work of Brad Roxalis was absolutely rock solid. And again, John Mosley with his research work and John Mosley and his combination effort there of researching and working to help develop the theory. And then George Palace, I mean, fantastic. And then the defendant, A.J. Fisher, this is the beauty of this. Everyone had a hand in this very, very heavy lift, and we've taken this thing over the top, and anyone can plainly see. We've provided expert witnesses, we've provided experts to back up the data, and the government has no experts. I would contend that the government probably spent the 2 extensions that they used that gave them weeks on end to locate experts that probably came back and said, gee, we're sorry, this is right. Data science doesn't lie.
How does the Trump immunity case factor in here? I mean, if the Supreme Court says that Trump was immune from any prosecution for his actions on January 6th, how does that affect some of the people you're trying to help?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So think back like this, and think in the times of, they often reference the Trump train, and it made me think about Lincoln and his visits on the trains across the country. And you're talking about right before Lincoln actually suspended habeas corpus. He was talking about some of this in speeches. Is it not possible that Donald Trump was talking about some of this idea of what he might be willing to do or thinking of doing with filing the Insurrection Act, had it not been for the events of January 6th? So the idea that a president can give speeches, talk about what he's doing, he shared with the public what he was doing with Mike Pence, and now we're looking at a situation where these cases are very flawed. What Jack Smith's doing here, the case is full of flaws, and we intend to root that out. So we're looking forward to our next amicus in the Supreme Court without giving away too much. We're way ahead of the game, and we're way over the top of Jack Smith.
Last word. So it sounds like you're pretty confident about what the result is going to be in that case. And lastly, look, and again, I'm going to give you the floor, but I don't think the American people understand to the extent that an overwhelming majority of the people who were at the Capitol on January 6th were unarmed. They thought they were allowed to be there. And look, we can have a debate whether what the specific law is, whether they were, on Capitol grounds without authorization, however you want to phrase it. Most of those people did not know they were doing anything wrong. And the idea that a bunch of unarmed Americans over the age of 55, which was a majority of the crowd, were there to overthrow the government is completely absurd. So last word to you.
Well, I'll tell you, so look at it like this quickly, that the most armed populace on the face of the planet came to overthrow the largest military industrial complex to ever exist with plastic flagpoles and megaphones. Come on now, let's be realistic. But I'm confident in this because we've done the work, we've done the studies. We got a 9-0 ruling on exactly what our work said. I'm telling you, the change of venue is going to be the same thing. We're looking forward to going to the higher court. We know the government will appeal when we win this change of venue, or vice versa. The higher court is going to uphold us. There's no way around what the law says. There's no way around what data analytics provide. And there's no way around what experts show to be the absolute facts this day and age that the government's already accepted and implemented all throughout the country in every other aspect.
Trennis Evans, founder of Condemn USA. Best of luck in your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's about it for us tonight on The Absolute Truth. We'll be back here same time tomorrow. Thanks for joining us.